Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome again to Syriana Analysis. I'm your host, Kevork Almassian. Thank you very much for tuning in to today's live streaming. I appreciate you all, whether you're watching us on YouTube or on Rumble. Today, I woke up in the morning, and the first thing I do is surfing on my X account, and I watched videos of Palestinian civilians burning alive in their refugee tents in the Gaza Strip. Every day, I tell myself that I lost my ability to be shocked. What else, what more can be done by Israel? I'm no longer shocked. But every day I am shocked again and again and again. Today, I would like to have a conversation with our friend Ahmed Shihab-Eldin. He is a journalist, producer, and an actor. He is originally from Palestine. I think his voice is very important, especially on the visual content on social media platforms. He is raising awareness about the Palestinian cause itself and especially on the human rights aspect. Ahmed, thank you so much, first of all, for coming. I know this is a dire time for the Palestinian people and especially those who live in the Gaza Strip at the current moment. I really want to start this conversation with you about this incident. I would call it a terrorist attack against innocent, defenseless, unarmed civilians in the midnight using American bombs falling over the heads of civilians. They're burned alive. I watched footage which it haunts you forever. You cannot really just remove it from your head any longer. People want really to understand what is the purpose behind such crimes. I mean, there is no military target there. Why Israel is relentlessly attacking the civilian population in such a way?
It's really good to be with you and to get straight to the conversation. I think the answer is, unlike we often hear, it's complicated. It's actually quite simple, and we're witnessing it. It is the ethnic cleansing, which is a policy that's been not only enacted, stated. I mean, for those who didn't wake up the way you did, let's just fill them in. Israel today bombed tents filled with displaced Palestinian families outside the Al Aqsa hospital. This is not surprising, as you said, because they've done it 7 times in the past 12 months in this exact location, burning entire families alive while they sleep. So we're not surprised, perhaps, that Palestinians continue to be massacred daily by Israel with the full backing of the US government. But to your point, Kevork, I mean, the image of hospital patients tethered to IVs as American supplied Israeli bombs ignite these fires around them. And then you see them shooting the ambulances trying to come there. I mean, uh, the term Holocaust, which is one I use today on social media, is actually derived from the Greek word, I believe, holos, which is whole, and kaustos, which is burned. I mean, that's what's happening. Israel has committed this specific wartime as a war crime 7 times. So they've been attacking every hospital, the entire healthcare facilities. Uh, we know this from the UN. I mean, we're now at a point where, I mean, I can't help but think of Aaron Bushnell, one of several Americans who self-immolated in protest of the US-backed Israeli genocide. You know, when in Tunisia, we've seen a self-immolation lead to the Arab Spring in terms of how the narrative was concocted. We've seen that happen multiple times in the United States. And he confirmed for us that this is just what the rules, we can't, the reason he did it is because the ultimate, if you will, protest for this so-called rules-based order. So yeah, I mean, it's harrowing, it's not surprising, sadly, but it is still to me shocking, despite how desensitized some people may be.
Since you mentioned rules-based order, it comes to my mind Joseph Borrell. Joseph Borrell from the EU, he famously said that the Europeans or the Westerners have established a garden and the rest
Hmm.
of the world is a jungle. And I would like to show you his recent tweet about what he said about this terrorist attack against the Palestinians. And he says, I condemn IDF strikes on a hospital and a school serving as shelters in central Gaza. Dozens of civilians seeking safety were killed and injured in dreadful circumstances. Mass evacuation orders, violations of international humanitarian law, disregard for civilian casualties will not make Israelis safer. And I only like the only thing came to my mind was like blah 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 because they don't really impose sanctions on Israel. But then we have the worst of the worst in the EU, Ursula von der Leyen. Ursula von der Leyen, she says that the Iranian regime's support to Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine is unacceptable and must stop. I
Hmm.
therefore welcome the adoption of our sanctions against individuals and entities in response to Iran's drone and missile transfers to Russia. More is needed. And I mean, the EU imposes more sanctions against Iran for not burning refugees alive in their tents. I mean, I'm 100% sure that they watch these videos. It's impossible if any of them have a smartphone not to see this footage coming from the Gaza Strip. It always strikes me that the audacity, of these politicians, like few hours after such an incident, posting something like this on social media and just expect the people to go through their lives and not to create a backlash and push against what they're doing. But despite the backlash, despite the protest, despite everything, nothing works here especially in Europe, right?
Well, I'm glad that you brought up all of that because I think we're at a point where the double standards and the hypocrisy is so blatant, is so perverse, is so obscene, and is deliberate, right? I mean, you say, isn't it absurd that they would do it then? No, they do it intentionally to distract. And, just look at Israel's president today saying it's a war crime for Hezbollah to have targeted Israeli military targets and
Yes.
dozens of soldiers rather than children, rather than hospitals, rather than journalists. It would be so laughable were it not, perverse and just being completely supported, to your point, and defended by the establishment in Europe and the US, as well as the media, too much of the media and too much of the political establishment. I mean, this really spells disaster for us all. I mean, Hezbollah's drones, I don't know how to put it. I mean, I don't know if you know, but right now, as you and I are speaking, police I saw on Twitter are dragging Jewish protesters by their arms and legs as they arrest them brutally for trying to stage, a protest and taking over the New York Stock Exchange with a very simple message: stop arming Israel. No one should profit off the murder of burning Palestinians alive. I mean, it's strange how we're already accustomed, you and I'm sure, and many of your viewers, I'd imagine, to the fact that so much of the mainstream media is guilty of manufacturing consent, not just since October 7th for the last 12 months, but really for decades and decades. And yet, today, even within Israel, within this fascist state, within this settler colonial state, within this ethno state, I mean, according to Israel's newspaper Haaretz, Israeli officials officially have deprioritized the hostage negotiations, which is evident, in favor of what they've told us all along is the goal, the gradual annexation and colonization of Gaza. So, senior defense officials in Israel are saying that these new, the 8, 9 consecutive days now in northern Gaza, to forcibly expel and eradicate and exterminate, so to speak, the people living there. I mean, these are, as you said, terror tactics that are being used, and it's indiscriminate. I mean, it's intentional, and it's strange that so much more of Israeli media is openly reporting facts, the truth, if you will, about what Israel says it wants to do and what it actually does, than the U.S. media, for example, or even in Europe. Even today, Sky News, the BBC. I mean, it's it's been it's been so demoralizing as a journalist to have to constantly point out how we've failed to do our very jobs. And as a Palestinian, it's been exhausting to have to scream, feel sometimes you have to scream to the world that you're human because of just the sheer level of dehumanization. And we go back to Israel has these kind of terms that don't mean anything, that are not grounded in either logic or law, that Israel, is a democracy, that
Hmm.
Israel has a right to self-defense. Yeah.
This is a point. First of all, I'm happy that you brought the media and the
Mhm.
press, and I I know very well how the press works. I This is not a secret, but this is for the first time I say it. I applied for the BBC when in 2016, and I
Hmm.
passed all their written exams, and they have multiple exams that you have to pass through, and then there was the interview. Of course, they wouldn't pick someone like myself; they would pick someone who is less of let's say pushing against the narrative. And I wasn't really famous in 2017 or had my YouTube channel or even tried to debunk all these narratives. But this was some sort of also trigger for me to see how they pick and choose journalists based not only on qualifications but also their political opinions and affiliations, and this is very important for them. And then you are giving interviews nowadays. I saw you on Talk TV. Was it Talk TV? Oh my God.
Yeah, such a
I
waste
don't
of time.
yeah, I believe that it's a waste of time. The producer of Talk TV followed me. I didn't follow him or her back. I don't remember the name because my participation there is just like we say in Arabic, jidal pizanti. It's like you're talking
طبعا.
to a wall, you know, you're talking to a wall at the end. But I salute you for your really still nerves because you're very calm and trying to speak logically, and you made her look, I don't remember her name, this journalist, this anchor, you really make
Julia.
her look, Julia, yeah, you really made her look bad, because you were calm, you were respectful, and you were presenting arguments, while her face expressions was clearly she doesn't consider you
Yeah.
as a Palestinian or someone comes from the
Well,
Middle East worthily.
worse. She doesn't consider me human. Look, very
Yeah,
briefly, sorry to interject. I mean, with Julia, a lot of people questioned why I did it, and I don't want to distract from what we're here to talk about, which is, the Palestinians. But the reason I did it is because it's disappointing, and you might notice I immediately started answering by referencing how the media is whitewashing Israel's ongoing crimes, right? And that's the reason to appear, to allow them to expose themselves and just make that assertion at the top. And then the interview itself, I think, demonstrates exactly that point and much more. So, but with time, you realize maybe it's a waste of time to talk to people whose agenda is so narrow and so obviously racist.
yeah, I think so. And I have a confession, not only for you, for everyone. To be honest
Sure.
with you, before October, so I've been living in Germany now for 9 years and
Hmm.
a little bit more. And when I came to Germany and started hearing people from my countries keep telling me, "Oh, people, it's a racist system here. You cannot really succeed because of the racism in the European." And I was like pushing against this narrative because I was like, "No, you're exaggerating. You don't know. You're just here for like you just barely arrived in Germany. Why do you say like it's a racist system? You know, like." You have to work, you have to do this and that, and I was pushing against this narrative.
Hmm.
And I came my life journey was like really it's interesting, like at some point I became more like a conservative right wingish, and then I started to move back to the middle, and now I'm like moving gradually to the left, but not the left like the Greens, for example, in Germany, or the Social Democrats who support genocide. But I'm coming from a ground like my it was an eye opening for me what happened in Gaza, because before that I thought that the politicians aren't aware of what's happening in the region. They're misled, they're
Hmm.
misinformed. Now I know for sure, for 100%, they know it, and they are deliberately giving
Yeah.
these weapons to Israel.
Yeah.
Chancellor Scholz said, "We gave weapons to Israel, and we will give weapons to Israel." In Arabic, we say like he literally said, "Ruhu khadua," we will give
Yeah.
weapons to Israel.
Yeah.
Do whatever you can. So
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what to say with regard. I really appreciate hearing that journey you describe. I think, as someone who spent a lot of my career in the media, for better or worse, reporting and trying to correct, let's say, misrepresentations, particularly of marginalized groups like the Palestinians, where dehumanization is either a very integral component of how the media is complicit in either misrepresenting them or spreading disinformation about them. I mean, I've been familiar with this for a long time, and I've witnessed, in terms of my own engagement, not just on social media, but as I navigate the world, people from so many different countries who, let's say, are waking up to sort of the dynamics and connecting a lot of the dots that perhaps otherwise might not have been so connected. And I think Israel and its so-called allies that are supporting this genocide are really not doing themselves a service and kind of making a lot of miscalculations, even though I know that they're aware, and trying to frame this about Iran, and trying to make this about a clash of civilizations. I was younger in 2003, but I was old enough to remember, the collusion between the media establishment and the invasion of Iraq. And it's very scary to imagine that we're here again. Of course, instead of Iraq, it's Iran. And yeah, I think Israel in particular, as well as many regional players, have really allowed things to get to the point where it's clear we're living in a jungle where the rule of law doesn't matter. And in this moment, so long as all the sort of masks try to stay on, they may think that this is just, you know, this is going to be sort of salvageable in terms of the broader implications beyond the region. It's worrying. It's really worrying. The fact that we hear, Kamala Harris say Iran is the biggest threat to the biggest enemy of the U.S., not China and Russia. I mean, we're in la la land yet again, and the media, it's been frightful to watch how willing the media has been to sort of enable and facilitate and obscure the basic facts. One
Yes.
fact is that Israel, for example, is not a democracy and has no
Yeah.
right to defend itself on land it occupies illegally.
Yeah, and but they come from this standpoint, right? That Israel is a democracy, which means Israel respects human rights and respects international law. This is what also Olaf Scholz said at the beginning of this carnage in the Gaza Strip. He says that we believe that Israel is following the rule of law, following the rules of engagement and the humanitarian law because it's a democracy. Now, democracy is a very broad term. Like there are different types of democracies. So, what is the political system in Israel? Like the Zionists say that, look, the Arabs, we have 2 million Arabs living in Israel, and they have the right to vote. What are you talking about? It's a democracy.
Yeah,
We have elections.
yeah. Well, to put it simply, I mean, a democracy means equal rights, and that is inherently not true of the so-called state of Israel. Israel is at best an ethnocracy. It is from its inception, and as we've witnessed, it's hard when you're witnessing a daily live streamed genocide with colonial language, colonial violence, um, to deny the fact that Israel is a settler colonial project. It's an apartheid regime. These are more accurate descriptions of what Israel is based on how it conducts itself. Um, Israel certainly has a veneer of democracy, but at its core, it's a settler colonial project, and it's very clear. It's about supremacy. One ethno-national group dominates over others. In 1948, when it was created, it codified supremacy in its laws to try to maintain, a Jewish majority, and it continues, as we've seen in the last 12 months, in the decades that preceded that. It annexes and confiscates, native Palestinian land. It establishes illegal settlements on occupied land. Its laws that have been written grant automatic citizenship to any Jew, regardless of where they were born in this big world. And this coupled with, the complete denial of any Palestinian's right of return, say my ancestors or any of the other millions of Palestinians that have been forcibly removed through violence, through terrorism since late 1930s and early 1940s. Um, this to me exemplifies why Israel's everything but a democracy. And what's really if you look to just today, the New York Times, we're talking about the role of media. It finally, admitted what so many of us have known and been saying, which is that Israel regularly uses Palestinians as human shields.
Yes.
And I bring this up because the human shields. There are a few lies and made up made up stories that are used and have been used for decades willingly in a very well coordinated and well funded um, attempt to to basically distract from what's actually happening on the ground, which is that Israel is somehow, because of the human shields, justified in committing all these war crimes and atrocities, because Hamas hides behind, and it's become so debunked and so dismissed by anyone with real common sense or access to basic internet connections, that we're having a real crisis of faith in a lot of the in I think across the world, if I'm honest with you. And there's so many other things I could tell you about the reality of life in Israel, about the fact that you have a different set of laws for one group of people based on another group of people. But I think it's quite obvious for anyone who wants to pay attention. Do you know what I mean?
Yes, and but I would like to show you. This is a very famous X account called it's a OSINT Defender, and
Mm-hmm.
look the phrasing and the words. Graphic footage showing Palestinians being burned alive as a result of Hamas munitions located with or near a refugee camp having
Mm-hmm.
exploded following Israeli precision airstrike.
Mm-hmm.
Over 1.2 million followers. Those are the pages that who form the public opinion, like um I think the issue of the human shield, using civilians as human shield, there are two aspects in it. One of which is the technical term. Like if you want to use someone as a human shield, you're hiding behind civilian populations, right? As whoever you
Mm-hmm.
are. But there is the second aspect of it, and that is they are trying to portray the Palestinian factions and Hezbollah, for example, as if they are aliens, like they came from somewhere outside, who are not part of Gaza. They're not part of southern Lebanon. They're not indigenous people. They just came and using the civilians, the Palestinians and the Lebanese, as human shields. So this is also there is the mental and the psychological aspect of it. They want to instill this in the
Mm-hmm.
subconscious of the people. Like these Palestinian factions, they're not Palestinians, they're aliens. They're using the Palestinians as human shields. They're not from the grassroots of the Palestinian people. The same goes
Yeah.
for Hezbollah.
Yeah, to your point, I mean, it's this idea that, as if Hamas and Hezbollah are not only foreign to their native populations, but as if they are only tangible, physical entities and beings. They are ideas. They are ideas that history teaches us any oppressed group will have a Hezbollah or a Hamas or a million other different manifestations of that basic actual human instinct and right to self defense, self protection, in the face of oppression. And so the entire thing is sort of, we're living in this kind of upside down world, right? And you can see it in terms of the sort of fracture points, like the media. And I hate to keep going back to the media, but let's be frank. I mean, the media can't even handle the plain truth. Um, and you have someone like Ta-Nehisi Coates,
Hmm.
um, you know, sort of going around and being paraded in very mainstream platforms in the U.S. this past week, and saying, talking about journalism's greatest sin, this idea of, because we're the agents, the people that are dehumanized, we're the agents in doing that dehumanization. And that's actually one of the stages of genocide legally, right? And when you exclude people, when you erase them from the conversation, as we've seen happen time and time again, um, I don't know how to explain it, but it's like we're at a point where in every arena you're trying to see the erasure of not just Palestinians, but to your point, like with the human shields thing, but even with Hamas, I mean, we keep hearing the term Gazans being used instead of
Hmm.
Palestinians. We've seen in the, the leaked New York Times style directives of like, don't use the word occupation, don't use the word even Palestinian or Palestine, don't use the word refugee school. I mean, we're at a point where the actual discourse is such that this, whenever I do media interviews, when they're more formal, of course, they go after the point that they try to make repeatedly and relentlessly is that Hamas and Hezbollah are terrorist organizations. Well, the Israeli government is led by a convicted terrorist by Israel, Ben Gvir. And we've seen former CIA director and many others um, admit very openly and clearly and plainly that Israel's tactics have been tactics of mass terror. And the very group that is being demonized as a boogeyman and as a terrorist organization by the US government and much of Europe is actually the one that is targeting military bases and soldiers, while the country that is so called a democracy and civilized and not barbaric is armed and funded by the US and Europe and is targeting civilians and children and residential areas. To me, that alone, that obvious juxtaposition, should not just be shocking, but should inform the policies and the decisions and the actions, not just the words, that leaders in the region and in Europe and the US are taking. I mean, now we have the US, of course, unsurprisingly, after Kamala Harris says Iran is the US's biggest enemy. Is it surprising that the US now says they have strong intelligence that Iran is supplying Russia with arms, that Russia is using to target civilians in Ukraine, and therefore that's the reason, because Russia is using arms supplied by Iran to destroy residential buildings in Ukraine, that's why the EU should be imposing sanctions on Iran, but yet somehow we shouldn't do that or even like discuss that or tolerate anybody to discuss that. It's troubling and it's wild.
It's beyond hypocrisy. And when I was talking to Lebanese journalist Radi Francis, and she had a really like one emotional moment, and she said, like, who are you to determine what is terrorism and what is which groups are terrorists? Like, your
Mm,
classifications and your lists of terrorism, it doesn't concern us. This is not we're not going to accept your labeling who is a terrorist and who is not. For you, anyone who uses armed violence, resistance, which is
mm-hmm.
permissible under international law against an occupation force, it's terrorism. I mean, if there was a press after Columbus's arriving to the US, and when there was an ethnic cleansing of the indigenous people there, if there was a press back then, they would have probably labeled it as a liberation of
Yeah,
the indigenous people, because this is what they say: we're coming to liberate you in the Middle East by killing the indigenous people, right? And
of
then those
course.
who fight back, they're the terrorists.
I mean,
Right?
that's why, no, exactly. I mean, this is nothing new, but I think what is new is that we were always fed and taught and sort of brainwashed, if you will, to believe that colonialism is a thing of the past. And clearly, our eyes and our ears are not lying to us. They are not deceiving us. We know who's doing the deception. And every day the U.S. and every day I should say that Europe and the U.S. And any powerful organization, individual, or country, really continues to perpetuate this upside down narrative, framing Israel as somehow the victim, not the aggressor, not the occupier, not the exterminator, not the expander. I mean, despite their best attempts to defy sort of logic and legal protections and norms. Um, the facts remain that Israel is every day now for almost 2 weeks annihilating northern Gaza, which was from the beginning, exactly a year ago, what we were told and what military documents from Israel revealed.
Exactly.
Uh, they're shooting and killing UN peacekeepers. It doesn't want anyone to witness their war crimes. That's why it's shooting and killing multiple journalists, as we've seen just this week, paralyzing them, killing them. using snipers. I mean, why wouldn't Israel want peacekeeping forces there? Why is that question not asked? I mean, and what's crazy and interesting to me is, we've seen Spain and sort of France and now Jordan say, call for an arms embargo. And of course, that's more words being used and still no action. But there are 34 countries that are a part of UNIFIL, right? It's the UN's peacekeeping force in Lebanon. And, these countries include China, Brazil, Spain, France, Ireland, South Korea, the UK. And when, Israel day in, day out bombs these peacekeepers, it should not be lost on all of us that that is an attack on all these countries in the world.
Yes.
Israel is attacking all those countries, and with all the attention, gravitating towards Iran and Israel, and this clash of civilizations, and the invasion of Lebanon, which is of course horrible and deserves attention. The truth is, the mass forcible eradication of native Palestinians from northern Gaza is at the crux of why October 7th
Yes.
happened and why Lebanon is being invaded and why Iran may be bombed this week or next week by Israel yet again. You know, this obscene breach of international law, it's happening in northern Gaza, and it's being documented by the remaining journalists on the ground that I'm in touch with daily. I mean, I see it happening, and what's so demoralizing is despite the reports, including by CNN, that no food has entered northern Gaza. Of course, they don't say who, they don't say it's Israel and how Israel is obstructing. It's just, no food is
Yeah.
somehow there.
No food.
Yeah, Israel is actually, I don't know how to put it, but, you know, um, there has been no shortage of visual or other documented evidence, including by UN investigators, who just published yet another report finding Israel guilty of, for example, deliberately targeting Gaza's health facilities, killing medical personnel. I mean, we're hearing from surgeons even today, talk about the death toll that we have being three times higher. I mean, call it what you want, but it's undeniable that our eyes and our ears are witnessing this sort of horror show play out. And Israel destroyed, as I hope people understand the gravity of this, more of Gaza proportionally than the Allies managed in Germany during the entire Second World War. It
Yes.
carried out more airstrikes in Gaza than the US and the UK did over a period of 3 years in Iraq against ISIS. I mean, we saw 100 American doctors and nurses who have been volunteering for 12 months before the healthcare system, of course, has essentially collapsed. Write an open letter to Genocide Joe, saying that the death toll was probably 3 or 4 times higher than the official figures. And we've seen these calls for embargoes, even in the UK. I mean, people who are, despite Keir Starmer saying that, there's not going to be a full arms ban, and despite the ICJ's landmark judgment, which actually ruled that the occupation itself was illegal.
Yes.
Um, since all these sort of mechanisms started to mechanize, what has Israel done? Israel has only acted with more aggression, intensifying the scope, the frequency of the war crimes, just judging by yesterday alone. I mean, limiting and starving the population in the north more. Um, the stranglehold on aid, by Israel has intensified since the ICC requested arrest warrants for both Netanyahu and Gallant. Um, I mean, the US continuing to spend $20 billion in just 1 year alone in military
Yes.
spending on this genocide. Um, it's I don't know. I
Ahmed,
mean,
28, do you know $28 billion? What does that mean against the Palestinians? I mean, how much budget
yeah, no, exactly,
all the neighboring
exactly.
countries of Israel combined, they don't have $28 billion budget per year
And
to pose any threat for Israel.
no, and I think the last thing I'll say, like, sometimes when you watch these sort of State Department and get, exchanges between the press and the State Department, Matthew Miller, for example, who what a
Horrible.
what I don't even have words, honestly. He said the quiet part out loud, and they do that sometimes. He said, "We've never," and this is verbatim, "we've never wanted to see a diplomatic resolution with Hamas."
Yes.
And if that's true and coming out of the horse's mouth, then that explains why, forgive me,
No
why
worries.
why there's been no red lines. You know what I mean? If Western politicians have no red lines when it comes to Israel, much of the same can be said of the West's establishment media as well.
Yes. Ahmed, Israel is, as you rightly mentioned, if you want, you can use your mobile
Yeah, I
and
don't know where it is.
uh,
Yeah, I'm trying to turn it off.
uh,
Apologies.
it's okay. Um,
Yeah.
You rightfully mentioned that Israel is not only violating international law, it's also
Hmm.
dismantling international system. Like
Yeah.
for example, targeting the UNRWA. Right? They
Hmm.
dismembered UNRWA mostly, and now they're coming after the UNIFIL. This is the representation of the international community, right? You
Hmm.
mentioned the multiple countries represented in these organizations, and they're providing
Hmm.
certain services, including
Hmm.
peacekeeping forces, for example, in southern Lebanon. Now, this is
Hmm.
coming at a very, let's say, crucial time when the politicians in the Israel, like Smotrich, Ben Gvir, Netanyahu, they speak about Greater Israel, and also
Hmm.
the Zionists, the Zionist Zionists, and also these Christian Zionists in the United States, preaching about an Armageddon scenario in the region. Do you really see that this is a they truly believe in this as a tangible goal, or they're bluffing, in order to scare their enemies in the region? Because Smotrich says our neighbors, our borders start in the Nile, and it stretches to the Euphrates, which means 2/3 of Syria. They want to occupy part of Saudi Arabia, entire Jordan, Palestine, Lebanon, and also the Sinai till the Nile River.
I think ultimately it doesn't matter. And I don't mean to be sort of dismissive, but what I will say is I think history teaches us that Israel has a pattern of sort of seeing what it can get away with, testing the US and sort of the rules based system, which, as we've learned, doesn't exist in this case, and Israel is an exception. And they do that in order to then, when we get to the ethnic cleansing, as we have, when we get to the genocide, when we get to the starvation, they know that they're likely to get away with it. So I think whether it's bluster or not, I mean, facts are facts. Israel is bombing more than four countries at the same time. It's invading Lebanon's sovereignty. It's violating the Vienna Convention. It's killed 200 UN workers in Gaza. It's killed more than 170 journalists. It is continuing to threaten and target journalists and UN workers. It's now, as you said, shooting, and we've established UN peacekeepers. It's violating the Geneva Conventions. It seized, as you said, the UN headquarters for UNRWA in occupied Jerusalem and announced plans to build settlements, as you said, and ban the UN Secretary General. And yet somehow Israel is invited and allowed to continue to give these speeches about greater Israel and Saudi Arabia and Jordan, what have you. I mean, in the first 2 months alone, Israel destroyed more of Gaza, as I told you. Now it's 10 months on top of that. I mean, it's really hard to understand, just I don't know how to put like the scale of devastation in Gaza, but also equally the scale of devastation to international law and the so-called rules-based order.
Yeah. I want to ask you one last question, Ahmad. And before that, I just want to tell the all our audience on YouTube and Rumble that it goes without saying. I put the link from the linked tree, right? This linked tree. This is a hyperlink, guys. You can click and you can check all the work of Ahmad. For example, you can see the new fault lines documentary. You can subscribe to Zetio. You can read about his biography. You can follow him on X. You can support him on Patreon. You can check his LinkedIn. You can follow him on Instagram. And also, you can donate to Gaza. This link includes all the other links that you can check. So that would be really appreciated. Ahmed, um, how to stop Israel? This is a $1 million question. And people protested, demonstrated, sit-ins, boycotts. I'm talking about ordinary people. Podcast talks. Nothing is going to stop Israel in this way. And I don't want to say only through military means, right?
Hmm.
Because it seems that Israel is telling the world that I'm not going to stop until someone stops me militarily. This is the message that the ordinary citizens are receiving, because all their efforts are going in vain, because Israel continues its atrocities against the
Yeah.
Palestinians. It expands to Lebanon, to Syria, and it just hits every other rule and order to the wall, right? So, what's the solution?
I think I mean, to put it very simply, the solution to all of this is to end the occupation, to end the illegal occupation, the collective punishment of the Palestinian people. In the short term, how do we get there? We have to start holding Israel accountable by exercising whatever pressure we have, whether that's trade agreements, military agreements. We've seen countries like Nicaragua completely end diplomatic ties and all ties with Israel. We've seen hints of what needs to happen, but there have been very, very powerful players, as you and I have discussed, that are obstructing all the mechanisms in place to start to hold Israel accountable. Unfortunately, it seems somewhat like maybe simplistic to some, somewhat reductive, but you can't hold one side accountable for war crimes and then use the other. Yeah, and then when you talk about the other side, which is disproportionately much more intense and violent, make every excuse, including what international law prevents, which is to use a war crime to justify another war crime, to arbitrarily start counting and looking for solutions 12 months ago or 5 years ago without addressing the root cause of the problem. And the root cause, of course, is that the Palestinian people have been oppressed, have been driven from their land, have been tortured, have been systematically raped, have been held in military courts without charge or trial, are living under an apartheid system. I mean, the facts on the ground have now been reported not just by NGOs and by independent experts and by UN special rapporteurs like Francesca Albanese and others. We've seen the general global consensus, not just in the global south. The UN's General Assembly votes in the past few weeks are indicative of this. The way to stop it is obvious, but the question really is, where do we start in the absence of the US and other powerful players like Europe actually doing the things that not just I'm saying, but in fact, some of their leaders are saying, such as Joseph Borrell, who you counted. When I saw his tweets this morning, first of all, he has a lot less power than, Ursula, for example, sadly. But it's really useless for these governments, for these officials and leaders to continue to tell us how, how horrible things are, or how even to condemn things without taking the steps. And it's not rocket science. And in the absence of that, we've seen people power. We've seen, despite the crackdown and the well coordinated crackdown in the US, in the UK, everywhere in Europe on college campuses to prevent that sort of collective power, the power of the people, from influencing public discourse through the media and how the media covers that. We're seeing this continue to grow and grow. And I would just say very briefly, if I had to put money on it, even with the October surprise in the US, I mean, Kamala Harris and Joe Biden, I think, have really done themselves and the Democrats and the US a disservice by making it that much easier for people to vote for Donald Trump. Um, and I think that choosing to kind of disregard not just Arab Americans, Muslim Americans, but youth, progressives. I mean, 80% of Democrats want not only a ceasefire, but almost 80% want arms to be conditioned to stop, want to stop sending weapons to Israel. And then you would ask yourself, why is the policy and even the rhetoric so dramatically far from that? it's not just a test or like an indication of how weak I would say America's democracy is. I think it speaks volumes about why, when so many of us talk about Palestine as much as we say free Palestine, in the end, the systems of oppression that we all face are interconnected, and maybe Palestine is now a cause, and the liberation of Palestine will, in the end, free us all from a lot of those systems. Because the way in which those systems are exposing themselves and being exposed, despite how much money and power and force is being put against them, I think it's hard to walk it back, and I think we're past that point, and it's
Yes,
scary. Yeah, it's scary.
we passed that point. I just want to make a point. I think I studied political science, and what I follow during such times, during a sequence of events, are the patterns, trying to connect the dots to understand what's going to happen next.
Mm,
However, above that, I have an intuition here. And my
mm-hmm,
intuition says, and after this all the carnage in the region, especially against the Palestinians after October 7, Israel cannot recover from this at all. And this
mm-hmm,
will bring the end of the political entity of the Zionist state there. There is no, in my opinion, chance for Israel to continue in its current form. Therefore, it will eat itself from within sooner or later. The moment these hostilities stop against the Palestinians, there is going to be huge backlash inside Israel itself. And Israel has created, if Gaza had 20,000 or 30,000 Hamas militants, it will have now tens of thousands of enemies, not only in Palestine,
yeah.
in all the neighboring countries. This is something that the Israelis have underestimated, and they have played all their cards. It's like a very high stake poker game for them. I understand from
Mm-hmm.
where they are coming from, but this is a lose game for them, and they will lose this game. And when you say the Free Palestine motto, I am for Free Palestine. I am for all the indigenous people, the Arabs, the Palestinians, whether Christians, Jews, Muslims, all. Those settlers who came from far away, from thousands of kilometers away, they should be given a choice. If you like to stay and live as
Mm-hmm.
a normal, equal citizens in a free territory there, you're free to stay. But if you want to have privileges above and you want to be treated as some sort of a pushy king on this territory, I think you have a second passport. If you want, you can live. I'm against violence in this case. However, this boundaries has to be set for the people to be able to coexist. Otherwise, this is going to be an endless cycle of violence. And my intuition says, in our lifetime, we're still young. We have a lot ahead of us, Ahmed. You and myself, we will have the chance to visit Free Palestine, and we will be able. I can't go now to Palestine. You know that, right?
Yeah,
With the Syrian
yeah.
passport, I can't go there. But I know that it's here, that there is going to be a time where I visit Palestine finally. Ahmed,
I
Habibi,
hope
thank you
so.
so much.
I hope I'm
Thank
there
you
with
so
you.
much. Yeah, I will. I
Thank
will. I promise you. And I think this is going to be sooner than people expect.
I
And
agree.
I don't sell illusions to the people, but this is the time when I believe that a system that is based on an apartheid and its survival and continuation is dependent on killing, it cannot survive. How many people are you going to kill to prove the point that you have the right to
No,
stay?
Kevork, I hate at the end. I want to agree with you, but then I think about the US and
Hmm.
a few hundred years ago, how it started and how it's going. And it survived
Com-
so far. But I
completely
also,
different completely different circumstances, believe me.
of
Now
course, of
the
course.
entire region is boiling against them. Put
Yeah, yeah.
the
The
rulers
context is
aside.
different.
Yeah.
Yeah, the context. But what I say is if you look at the map of like Native Americans and you look at the map of Native Palestinians, that simple Bantustan ghettoization, the division, the divide and conquer strategy. I mean, you can choose to look at the Native Americans. You can also choose to look at Algeria. You can choose to look at many, but as you know, I'm in agreement with you. It's a matter of time, and we can already see the crumbling and the dismantling. They're doing it to themselves at a obscene human cost.
Yeah.
But here we are.
Inshallah. This
Inshallah,
is the
we'll be
real
there.
inshallah, then not the inshallah
Yeah,
of that we say.
it's been good. It's been good to be
Yeah.
with you. Thanks, and
Yeah,
stay in
Habibi,
touch.
thank you so much
Okay,
for having
take care.
me.
All right, brother. Be well.
Guys, thank you so much for tuning into today's live streaming. I appreciate you all. We will come again tomorrow on Tuesday, 5 p.m. Central European Time, 11 a.m. Eastern American Time. Peace be upon you, upon your families. And don't forget to subscribe to Syriana Analysis. 60% of the viewers of Syriana Analysis are not subscribed. You can check and see if you are subscribed or not. If you're not, I would really appreciate it if you subscribe. That helps me a lot. So we will see you tomorrow, guys. Salam.